Welcome to the Synthesis of Yoga, the book that changed my life. For those who are new here, we are diving deep into Sri Aurobindo's The Synthesis of Yoga, the book that has distilled India's yogic traditions and gave us the integral yoga, the yoga of evolutionary future of humanity. The next step in evolution, what is the yogic process we need to follow? And this book is the answer to it. And we are reading this book chapter by chapter, line by line, to internalize, come in touch with Sri Aurobindo's yogic consciousness. And the very act of reading is a sadhana, a transformative practice. We have reached the 7th chapter of part 1, Standards of Conduct and Spiritual Freedom. In our last episode, which was 99, Sri Aurobindo showed us how even the Shastras are inadequate. Shastra is a Sanskrit term for kind of an equivalent of science. Here, the rules and laws are derived from an understanding of the highest nature of human being. Then what is visible to our eyes from great masters who have accomplished higher self-realization, from that higher understanding, laws are derived to supplement and complement and support the social law, which is external, and moral law, which is man's internal mental rules and regulations. In spite of these three coming together, still it will not be sufficient to guide us continuously, because every law is time-bound. The moment you reduce something into a law, into a rule, it becomes time-bound form with its limitation, with its expiry period. Unless all the rules, laws, standards are continuously upgraded with the march of time, there is no way to make use of the living power of rules and regulations. So even Shastras fail because they have to translate themselves. A higher consciousness has to translate itself into a rigid formula suitable for a particular time period, complementing that particular society's external codes of conduct, standards of conduct, as well as people's inner moral ideas. And eventually they expire and they cannot continue and they become obsolete. Only an ascension into higher consciousness by people living from there and the light and force of the supramental consciousness, that alone can continuously, moment to moment, guide people towards their individual and collective perfection. So this point Sri Aurobindo repeats again and again, showing the limitations of even the Shastra. Before that, he brought in the limitations of morality, ethics, and even what was more primitive. All that were highly inadequate if we are seeking perfection in a society, individual and collective perfection. Now let's move on to the new episode, which is 100th. Beautiful number. We have now completed with this. We are entering into the 100th episode of the Synthesis of Yoga. And we are starting with paragraph 28. And the link to this chapter, Standards of Conduct and Spiritual Freedom, is available in the description. Kindly follow the text so that you can get a taste of Sri Aurobindo's way of writing, integrity of his writing, recursive patterns of his writing, and underlying vision and the consciousness and its force and light, we can come in touch with that. So paragraph 28. The culmination of the soul's constant touch with the Supreme is that self-giving which we call surrender to the divine will, an emergence of the separated ego in the one who is all. So an entire surrendering of the ego and its dissolving of the ego into the oneness of the Supreme Being. That is what we are referring to also as the surrender in yoga. In surrender, the ego surrenders and dissolves itself so that it can become one with all, the Supreme Being. And it is in that surrender the Supreme Master takes up the instrumentation. And that's a culmination of soul's journey, the evolutionary journey, in which there is initially a contact and then eventually a merging with the Supreme Consciousness. Here we are using the word Supreme because just above the human mental range and just beyond the human ego, there are various levels of collective consciousness and higher ranges of consciousness that are not necessarily the Supreme Consciousness. So we need to ascend plane after plane all the way to the supra-mental consciousness. That alone enables the integral vision of the formless one and the multiplicity together, the dynamic oneness, not the static oneness of the formless, but the dynamic oneness in which the entire creation is experienced, seen from the dynamism of the creative force, the dynamic absolute. That is what will give us the picture. So the culmination of the soul's constant touch with the Supreme. So initially the soul comes in touch with the Supreme Consciousness. That is only a touch. But eventually there is a greater self-giving. This culmination of the soul's constant touch with the Supreme is that self-giving which we call surrender to the divine will. We are surrendering to the divine will. Our individual will get dissolved, get integrated with the divine will. And emergence of the separated ego in the one who is all. So there is a merging, emergence of the separated ego in the one who is all. The one being behind all things. Isha vasyamidam sarvam. The one who is inhabitant of all forms, the tiniest to the largest, from subatomic particles to the cosmological structures, everything. A vast universality of soul and an intense unity with all is the base and fixed condition of the supramental consciousness and spiritual life. A vast universality of the soul. There is the discovery of the soul. As we dive deeper inward, it is not an individualized, separate soul. We enter into universalization and merging with the larger existence. So there is a vast universality of the soul and an intense unity with all. Is the base and fixed condition. So this is the experiential, existential foundation required. It is the condition, the base and fixed condition of the supramental consciousness and spiritual life. Spiritual life can be lived. Supramental consciousness can be realized and operationalized here on earth only on this fixed condition of the universality of the soul. In that universality and unity alone can we find the supreme law of the divine manifestation. There is a law of manifestation. Everything comes into existence in the field of time and space. What is the law that governs this manifestation? The process of manifestation from the formless all the way into the concrete materiality of form. There are laws governing. Our modern science is working with the laws of physical plane and now peeping into that which is non-physical. In yogic knowledge, you go beyond the physical dimension into the energy dimension, into the mental dimension, into the spiritual dimension. It is from there you see the totality. And in that universality and unity alone can we find the supreme law of the divine manifestation. There is a supreme law of divine manifestation. That law can be known only when we ascend into this higher spiritual supramental range of consciousness. In the life of the embodied spirit, if we are to bring it into the life of the embodied spirit, in that alone can we discover the supreme motion and right play of our individual nature. Supreme motion and right play. The whole cosmos, the cosmic creative dance, is envisioned by the ancient traditions in many ways. One of them is seeing it as the dance of Shiva. Another one is seen as the play of Sri Krishna, Leela. All this beautiful imagery shows the divine being in its creative, ecstatic dance, which has its motion, which has its play. That can be experienced only when we are ascending into these higher levels of being and not living by moral, ethical, social standards of conduct. When we transcend the rules, transcend the standards set by mind, ethics, morality, external laws, and ascend, then we discover the supreme motion and right play of our individual nature, which is animated, governed by the divine supreme law. So in that universality and unity alone can we find the supreme law of this divine manifestation in the life of the embodied spirit. We are embodied spirit here in matter, on earth. In that alone can we discover the supreme motion and right play of our individual nature. Our individual lives are woven into the collective life. And there is a right play, there is a swabhava and swadharma for each individualized manifestation, which is in perfect harmony with everything else when it is aligned with the supreme consciousness. And its motion and its play can be known only when we ascend into these higher planes and universalize ourselves. In that, we are not losing our individuality. In fact, our individuality finds its perfect fulfillment in the universality of our being. In that alone can all these lower discords dissolve themselves into a victorious harmony of the true relations between manifested beings who are portions of one Godhead and children of one universal mother. We do have discords in our lower nature. What is referred to as lower nature is our mental, vital, physical dimensions of existence, where there is this multiplicity. And within them, there are discords. Even within the mind, we find ideas clash with each other. They don't come into coherence. Within the heart, we find emotions in conflict. Within the physical body, we find in the collective life constant conflict, discord. All this will resolve themselves into a victorious harmony. A victorious harmony, not a temporary harmony. There is a victorious harmony of the true relation between manifested beings. We are manifested beings, embodied spirit. Human beings alone are now 8.2 billion. Even if we are to just bring in harmony among the human beings, how do we do? What is the source of that harmony? That can be brought into collective life only when the individuals are sent into the supramental consciousness and bring it down into an embodied condition, and you yourself are universalized. Through that, you become the transmission point. Through that, we are establishing harmony in the collective life of humanity on earth and bringing the next step in our collective evolution. So the true relationship between manifested beings, and who are these manifested beings? Who are portions of the one Godhead. We are portions, amsha, and children of one universal mother. Therefore, in integral yoga, the recognition of the Divine Mother, the Divine Shakti, is of central importance. One Godhead manifesting through the Divine Shakti. She is the Mother. Divine love that is upholding everyone, every creature, coming in touch with her universal love. That and her power, and surrendering to her light, force, love, delight. She is Anandamayi, Chaitanyamayi, Satyamayi. It is that is our refuge in this yoga. This will come back again and again and again. The error of the past is individuals having the higher experience, but then having translated that experience into standards of conduct in alignment with prevailing moral, regulatory ideas or social laws. That has only temporary function, because they are all inevitably, eventually end up becoming obsolete. And that is what happened to all the great masters and their teachings, whether it is prophets or Christ or Buddha or all the rishis. Eventually, we convert them into laws, the Manu Samhita, the laws of Manu, laws of Confucius, laws of Moses, laws of Muhammad. The moment we convert everything into laws and regulations, we miss eventually the journey, because they are relevant only contextually during a certain period of collective life. They become obsolete. They get fossilized. In the march of time, humanity is progressing. They require new articulation, new expression, continuous renewal, and recasting into new forms. And that is what saved India from becoming too rigid, monolithic, religious society. India saved herself by having a continuous stream of realized masters who went on recasting, breaking the old, giving it a new form. From the Vedas to Upanishads to Gita to Tantra to Puranas to yoga, modern forms of yoga, there had been a continuous recasting and an endless variety and range of spiritual teachers who recast based on their experience. But these were still individual realizations. And they were always recasting into rules, policies, principles that the collectivity is to follow. That can only last for a certain period. The only lasting solution what Sri Aurobindo has found is when the supramental consciousness is itself brought down, and supramental light and force cannot be converted into laws, rigid rules, policies, principles. Yes, principles, yes, but not laws, codes of conduct, fixed, rigid, mechanical. Supramental force, when it is embodied, and that is possible only when you are universalized. Universalization means the entire earth consciousness is within you, and the whole cosmos is within you. Not just at spiritual level, but all the way the level of the mind, the vitality, and even the material physicality. That is what integral knowledge and force and love is. There is a totality from the formless to the most concrete form. One conscious being and its force acting through all. And that is the supramental force, where knowledge, love, and power are united. That alone can bring us the right law and rhythm and force, moment to moment. So in that alone can all these discords resolve themselves into a victorious harmony of the true relations between manifested beings who are portions of the one Godhead and children of one universal Mother. All conduct and action are part of the movement of a power, a force, infinite and divine in its origin and secret sense. So here is all conduct and action. We are individuals. We have to conduct our lives. There are actions to be done. All conduct and action are part of the movement of a power, a force, infinite and divine in its origin and secret sense. We individually, when trapped in our tiny little ego-bound consciousness, are not aware of this power, this force that is infinite and divine in its origin and secret sense. And even though the forms of it we see seem inconscient or ignorant, material, vital, mental, finite. So when we look at a stone, it is so inconscient. We look at activities of plants and animals, very material, vital, mental movement in a very finite way. We see so much ignorance, limitations, obscurity. And it is hard to believe how is it possible that all this is in its secret origin coming from an infinite and divine consciousness, one power, one force. How it is possible? Because we cannot see. It is our limitation, our ego-bound consciousness cannot truly see, which is working to bring out progressively something of the divine and infinite in the obscurity of the individual and collective nature. So through this obscure formations in the material, vital and mental entities, this one power, one divine consciousness is working to bring out progressively. It is a progressive movement. That is what evolution is. Something of the divine and infinite. We are finite. Within this finite material, vital, mental envelope, that eternal power is bringing in the potentialities and possibilities of the infinite, divine and infinite, in the obscurity of the individual and collective nature. It is bringing in not only in the individual but also in the collectivity. If we look at past historic records of spiritual development, it had largely been isolated individuals who are worshipped because they have realized something very, very high from the perspective of our human nature and its limitations. But they were isolated individuals. It had never been an established, universalized consciousness in the collective life of humanity. For example, now, human mind and mental development and mental culture has been universalized on earth. It is normal to expect everyone to know reading and writing, which is a mental capacity. Now, the evolution is tending towards the next step to going beyond humanity, that luminous inner growth into divine consciousness in a widespread way across humanity. That is the step towards which we are moving. For that to happen, supramentalization has to happen. All conduct and action are part of the movement of a power, a force, infinite and divine in its origin and secret sense, and will, even though the forms of it we see seem inconscient or ignorant, material, vital, mental, finite, which is working to bring out progressively something of the divine and infinite in the obscurity of the individual and collective life. So this integral yoga is at once individual and collective yoga. Crucibles like Aurobindo are laboratories for collective yoga, not just individual yoga. It is not about individual liberation, but individual and collective transformation. This power is leading towards the light, but still through the ignorance. We are here on earth in the material nature, embodied spirit, but not aware of our spiritual reality. Bound within ignorance, but it is within this framework of ignorance that divine power is still finding its progressive workings, revelations, and gradual transformation, which we call evolution. This power is leading towards the light. Light here is capital L. The supreme light, light of the divine consciousness. But still through the ignorance, avidya. That light is working through ignorance, the darkness of our unrefined, unevolved nature. It leads man first through his needs and desires. That is how it initiates the journey, creating the needs and desires. The emergence of desire itself in the very early stage of evolution, internal needs, hunger drives you. Desire for sex drives you. Desire for food, for possession, for territory drives you. So all these were the initial strategies used by evolutionary force, the divine force behind the material nature, which was obscure. It has to move the material nature. It has to awaken within the life forms. It has to become conscious in the human being. And within the individual, there was this drive of needs, desires that propelled the individual. That is what drove evolution in its early stage. It guides him next through enlarged needs and desires, modified and enlightened by a mental and moral ideal. So the first stage is pure drive of the instincts. In the next stage, you are enlightened and illumined by the light of reason, the mental development. That's the second stage. It guides him next through enlarged needs and desires. What was very limited in the instinctive life, animal nature, that gets expanded and enlarged when the mind enters the picture. Very needs and desires get enlarged into the larger desires, modified and enlightened by a mental and moral ideal. That's the second stage. It is preparing to lead him to a spiritual realization that overrides these things and yet fulfills and reconciles them in all that is divinely true in their spirit and purpose. So we are now being prepared to enter the third stage of a spiritual realization, in which these first two are not rejected and thrown away, but what is the essential truth behind them? All are brought out, elevated, refined, and harmonized, synthesized, not just overriding, but harmonizing into their divine fullness and their original spiritual purpose. So it is preparing to lead him to a spiritual realization that overrides these things and yet fulfills and reconciles them. Our vital instincts, our mental quest, everything gets reconciled in all that is divinely true in their spirit and purpose. That is the journey we are into. That is the turmoil the world is into. And we can consciously participate in that transformation when you become aware of this evolutionary process that is unfolding, and we are right in the middle of it. It transforms the needs and desires into a divine will and ananda. Needs that drives us. Behind there is a will. When we go deep into this and discovers the divine will, we see the infinite power acting. What appeared as a need within the tiny human vessel, behind it is revealing the divine will that is operationalizing the individual. Then what appeared as a desire for fulfillment of pleasure or whatever you're desiring, behind the desire, you discover the divine ananda. Desire is a distortion, a degeneration, a limitation, a tiny, narrow outlet that exhausts itself. In its origin, it is the divine ananda. So this is what we will discover when we refine the needs and desires and go to the very source of it. This is the discovery that we make. It transforms the needs and desires into a divine will and ananda. It transforms the mental and moral aspiration into the powers of truth and perfection that are beyond them. So within our mental and moral aspiration, there is the powers of truth and perfection, capital T, capital P. The truth consciousness of the divine reality and perfection of the divine consciousness. These are the things that we discover because our human mind is stumbling, searching, and its innate instinct is to look for better, higher and higher perfection. So is our moral aspiration towards goodness. All that finds its true reconciliation in the spiritual reality. It transforms the mental and moral aspiration into the powers of truth and perfection that are beyond them. These truth and perfection are beyond the mind. That is why it is absolutely unavoidable for us to ascend beyond the mind into the higher ranges, all the way to the supramental consciousness of the divine reality. Then we see the powers of truth and perfection getting operationalized across the full spectrum of consciousness, all the way down to mind, into the vital, into the very material physical, into the very cellular consciousness, and they eventually undergo transformation. It substitutes for the divided straining of the individual nature. It substitutes for the divided straining of the individual nature. Our individual nature has a divided straining. First of all, we find ourselves experientially separated from the rest, and we are in a straining competition and confrontation with all other life that is around. When we look inside, we again see a division between mind, emotions, sensations, drive, impulses, desires. So there is a division, fragmentation inside, there is a division, fragmentation outside. Therefore, there is a divided straining of the individual nature. We do not experience ourselves to be whole and complete. There is an incompleteness, sense of incompletion that drives, and it is a divided straining of the individual nature. This is substituted for the passion and the strife of the separate ego. Our ego experiences itself to be separate, and even if it is limited, it has its passion and strife. So it substitutes for the divided straining of the individual nature, for the passion and strife of the separate ego, the calm, profound, harmonious, and happy law of the universal person within us, the central being, the spirit that is a portion of the Supreme Spirit. This is the transition we are making, discovering the calm, the profound, harmonious, and happy law of the universalized person within us. So the discovery of the psychic being leads us towards universalization. Universalized person within us, the central being. So initially there is the discovery of the very presence of the divinity within. And as we dive deeper, it widens and widens, and as well as it ascends. Remember, last two chapters of the synthesis of yoga, it was about the ascent of sacrifice. It is the psychic being that brings the ability to give ourselves and surrender ourselves entirely into the hands of the divine consciousness. And in that surrender, there is an expansion, there is a widening, and there is an ascension. And in that, what we discover as our psychological center ascends into higher planes and discovers the central being that presides over the individual being. individual this individual construction who is operationalized in this material nature. The spirit that is a portion of the Supreme Spirit. There is a Supreme Spirit, the cosmic spirit. We are an eternal portion of that. That portion is presiding over the birth and growth of the individual and our individual evolution. That's our central being that presides over this growth. It is to that we have to arrive at. So this growth, it substitutes for the divided straining of the individual nature, for the passion and strife of the separate ego, the calm, profound, harmonious, and happy law of the universalized person within us. The central being, the spirit that is a portion of the Supreme Spirit. So we begin to experience, or we establish in that experience, that I am an eternal portion of the Supreme Spirit, one with that, and universalized. Though you still have this tiny little body, which others recognize as this tiny little person. But behind that person is the being who has universalized. You are not bound by this body. And this universalization operates at all the levels. Universalization of the body that enables you to embrace the whole earth. Universalization of the vital that embraces the whole life on earth. Universalization of the mind that embraces the whole mind. Terrestrial mind as well as the cosmic mind. And universalization all the way to the highest spirit. That is the evolutionary possibility lying dormant within us, which we are not aware. Therefore, we struggle with our tiny little ego identity. This true person in us, because it is universal, does not seek its separate gratification. Very crucial point. We experience ourselves individually to be separate. Therefore, we seek a separate gratification. My growth, my fulfillment. Even when people enter into spiritual path, they say, my dharma, my swadharma. Everything is mine. My passion. Mine, 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 mine. It has to dissolve. It will dissolve when we discover our universal nature. Because our true person in us is universal, it does not seek its separate gratification. When you are universal and all is in you, you are in all, there is no question of separate gratification. In fact, your fullness is the fullness of the whole. This true person in us, because it is universal, does not seek its separate gratification, but only asks in its outward expression in nature. Outward expression in nature. Its growth to its real stature. In the outward expression, which is material, vital, mental nature, in that framework, it seeks to grow its real stature, because you know your real stature is spiritual, supramental. But it cannot express itself fully within the molds of the mind, life, and body. Therefore, it seeks that expression within that framework. So only ask its outward expression in nature, its growth to its real stature, the expression of its inner divine self, transcendent spiritual power and presence within it, which is one with all and in sympathy with each thing and creature and with all the collective personalities and powers of the divine existence. And yet it transcends them and is not bound by the egoism of any creature or collectivity, or limited by the ignorant controls of their lower nature. At once in empathic alignment, oneness with the whole, yet transcending everything. That gives the space for a complete freedom from the individual and collective egoism. Otherwise, what happens is you're expanding, you're identifying with the collectivity. And what you identify with is the collective ego, the collective mind, collective vital. Though we may still call it transpersonal because it transcends the person, it is still within the collective ego. So unless you ascend into the higher planes, transcends all this, the danger of identification with even the collective ego is there. So this liberation also brings the possibility of transformation at an individual and collective level. This true person in us, because it is universal, does not seek its separate gratification, but only asks in its outward expression in nature, its growth to its real stature, the expression of its inner divine self. That inner divine self eventually is finding its progressive expression in the individual and the collectivity. And this true person that transcends spiritual, that transcendent spiritual power and presence within it, which is one with all and in sympathy with each thing and creature. So while seeking growth of its real nature in this individual and collective, its expression of its in the inner divine self that transcends spiritual power and presence within it, which is one with all and sympathy with each thing and creature, and with all the collective personalities and powers. There are all collective personalities. We are aware of individual personalities. We are not at all aware of collective personalities. There are collective personalities, the group beings and powers of the divine existence. And yet it transcends them and is not bound by the egoism of any creature or collectivity, or limited by the ignorant controls of their lower nature. So there is this lower nature of mental, vital, physical nature, and behind the tiny little individual, there are these collective personalities and archetypal beings that govern a group. Beyond these archetypal beings, we ascend into a higher transcendent power. And from there is, on one hand, a complete identification, empathic oneness. Other hand, there is this transcendent freedom. So that you see the game at multiple levels. On one side, there are tiny little individuals. Then individuals belongs to collectivity, and collectivities are governed by archetypal powers and beings. And beyond that, super collective archetypes, which many traditions would refer as gods, godheads. So these powers and personalities, you transcend them all and see their workings. And you're identified and flowing through all, yet free from all, and harmonizes them all because of this supreme identification or transcendent poise in the supramental consciousness. This is the high realization in front of all our seeking and striving, and it gives the sure promise of a perfect reconciliation and transmutation of all the elements of our nature. So this high realization is what gives the reconciliation and transmutation of all the elements of our nature. The physical elements, vital elements, mental elements, everything is individually and collectively transmuted, reconciled, harmonized towards their greatest perfection. This is the high realization in front of all our seeking and striving, and it gives this sure promise of a perfect reconciliation and transmutation of all the elements of our nature. A pure, total, and flawless action is possible only when that is effected and we have reached the height of this secret Godhead within us. Flawless action. The flow state. Flowing, not just flowing, but flawless, error-free, defect-free. Because it is the universalized being that is dancing through the collectivity and the individual. And your individual center is only a transmission point for something that is universal. So a pure, total, flawless action is possible only when that is effected and we have reached the height of this secret Godhead within us. Secret Godhead, which is in the highest height of our being, the supra-mental consciousness, which has to be realized. In that divine realization is this flawless action across the planes of existence, in the mental plane, vital plane, physical plane, in the individual, in the collectivity, through the archetypal powers, through the individual powers. Everything at once harmonized, transmuted, synthesized. That is the flawless perfection towards which evolution is moving. And it is to this journey Sri Aurobindo has opened the pathway. And this book, The Synthesis of Yoga, gives the key to it. And so with that, we come to the end of this episode. We have one more episode to go to complete this chapter. Looking forward to hear your feedback, your observations, suggestions. See you next week. Thank you.